Yeah, mine's about in that condition as well.
Yeah. What about what do you think of Maud?
I don't remember it very well.
Okay. It's kind of tiny.
Yeah, it's kind of
an outline form.
Reader size.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you see this one? It's got the 16 or 15 form.
Yeah.
What was that one, Father Patrick? Put that up again, if you would.
Sorry, my mute button was on. The American Prayer Book.
Oh, Parson and Jones. Yeah, we got that one.
Yeah.
I've got that somewhere. It's probably one of those boxes I haven't dug out yet.
Yeah, and then I have also the Oxford American Prayer Book one. Yeah.
St. Massey Shepherd.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not overly fond of Massey Shepherd. He occasionally dives off into the land of, I want to do it this way, so I'm going to make a dodgy argument to do it that way.
Yeah.
Get my chair straight. I'll be a lot happier. There we go. Shut up, dog. The other thing I need to do is hit the strangle switch on the phone. Okay, I've got 8:30 according to my never right clock. So we will make a start. Now, last week we looked at the origins of the liturgy up to 1500, which leaves this week free for having a look at the earliest attempts at reform. And many of these, of course, were no more than ephemeral. But two basic types emerged out of the Reformation. The first, obviously, is the Lutheran type, but it has to be remembered that Zwingli and Luther started their reforming movements at just about the same time. There's only a couple of years difference. And as a result of this, we'll have a quick look at the Reformed liturgy first, and then go on to the Lutheran liturgies, because at the end of the day, the Reformed influence comes in through Butzer's adaptations of Lutheran liturgies rather than directly from the Reformed tradition. Each bears the marks of its distinctive approach. The Reformed service tends to smack rather of the old preaching service of Prone. Now, back in the Middle Ages, when sermons had been a rare event, they weren't always attached to the liturgy. And they grew up a custom of having a sort of short prayer service before a sermon was delivered outside of the context of the liturgy. And a shorter version of this service of Prone was often used during the Sunday Mass when a sermon was preached. And it often consisted of the Lord's Prayer, the Hail Mary, a brief confession of sin, a series of prayers, ending with the prayer for the departed, and the Lord's Prayer before the sermon began. And it seems to be Prone that gave the basic model for the Reformed preaching service. Zwingli the humanist was not particularly orientated towards the visual side of religion. He had a great love of words and a great understanding of language, but when it came to the visual side, I get the general feeling that when he saw it, he sort of reacted against it as being a contravention of the second commandment and wanted to get rid of it. So his general tendency is to make the liturgy as word-orientated as he can. And his approach, therefore, is extremely austere. And as it matured, some of Zwingli's more radical views were moderated, so that you have, with the Reformed tradition, an evolved an evolving situation, starting with the very bare service that Zwingli introduced in Zurich, gradually being enriched elsewhere until the familiar Reformed type, which really owes as much to Martin Bucer in Strasbourg and Calvin in Geneva, and of the two, I think Bucer rather than Calvin, which served as a model for Reformed worship on the continent. I'm going to fight a little bit shy of discussing Scots Presbyterianism, mainly because it's really out of our period at this point. Now, the Swiss Reformed churches developed a regional type of liturgy based on Prone, and the best example of the type is probably the Strasbourg liturgy of Bucer, which was first drawn up in 1525 and then significantly revised in the mid-1530s. And it was also to supply the model for Calvin in Geneva and also for the early Church of Scotland services. The modern Church of Scotland and John Knox's would kind of got along with each other in a roundabout way when it came to liturgy, in that what Knox wanted was actually quite a lot richer than what the Blue Banner revolutionaries put forward in the 1640s. So what you have in Bucer's Strasbourg or in Calvin's Geneva is a preaching service which begins with an invocation, a confession of sins and an absolution, a prayer for illumination, a psalm, a lesson, the sermon, the Apostles' Creed, the general prayer, the Lord's Prayer, and ending with the blessing. And then when the Lord's Supper was celebrated, they added a communion exaltation, the fencing of the table, the words of institution, communion itself, a prayer of thanksgiving, and then the blessing was transferred to the end of the communion service. Now, the great difference to previous practice with the Reformed service, first of all, is the table was freestanding and the minister stood behind it, and they gathered the people around. And the elements changed from the familiar wafer bread of the Middle Ages to leavened bread, and the wine was undiluted. The mixed chalice disappeared. And the Reformed rites in the early days were actually quite prescriptive, in that there was a definite text from which the minister could vary on occasion, rather than the tendency that you get in 18th century Scotland, where there's a model from which everybody deviates all the time. And this change of attitude really has a lot to do with the Scots Church's engagement with Anglicanism rather than the Reformed type of liturgy in general. Now, I have to be honest and say I'm not very good on the Reformed liturgy. It's kind of the wrong side of the English Channel for me and a little too far south. The Reformed type does come into Britain in the Church of Scotland in 1560. It works there very successfully up until the introduction of the Westminster Directory, where things are tweaked around a bit. It took me a long time to overcome my aversion to the Reformed tradition, because my experience of the Reformed tradition had been Ulster Scots Presbyterianism, which is probably the most hard-headed and rationalistic version of the Reformed faith you can run into. The other thing is that culturally, Scots Presbyterianism spends an awful lot of energy being anti-English. Now, the other figure who was early in producing liturgies inevitably was Luther. But as is so often the case with Luther, Luther takes a lot of prompting to deal with the whole liturgy issue. The first Lutheran liturgy, as it were, was Karlstadt's cowboy operation at Christmas 1522, which really went way too far for the stage at which the Reformation was at. For example, he ditched Eucharistic vestments. He ditched significant parts of the Latin service. He invited the laity to receive the cup, and he consecrated simply by repeating the verba, the words of institution, over the bread and the cup. And this caused something approaching a riot in Wittenberg. There were those who agreed with Karlstadt and those who thought he was going way too far, way too fast. And it was one of the events that prompted Martin Luther's return to Wittenberg from the Wartburg in the early part of 1522. And as a result of this, Luther begins looking at the liturgy. And what he does is he reforms the liturgy on the basis of his objections to the Old Mass. And the two primary targets, so far as Luther is concerned, are the offertory, because Luther is opposed to any sort of notion of the Mass as a propitiatory sacrifice. That's one of his absolute bottom line. I have written about this at length, both in Latin and German issues. The second issue is that he regards the canon as having been deeply corrupted by its association with the medieval church. And so the Wittenberg reformer set about the Old Mass not to create a new liturgy, but to clean up the old one. So Luther's first attempt, the Formula Missae, basically retains much of the old Latin Mass. So the introit, the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Collect, the Epistle, the Hallelujah, the Gospel, the Creed, the Preface, the Sanctus, the Lord's Prayer, the Annius, the Post-Communion Collect, and the Dismissal all remain intact. However, there are some significant changes. The offertory prayers disappear. The canon disappears and is replaced by a simple recital of the verba at the end of the preface. And it was this type of liturgy that proved dominant in northern Germany throughout the next 250 years. Gradually, more and more of it was put into German, an easy transfer into German once Luther's German Bible was available, or Bugenhagen's Low German Bible, was to put the lessons into German rather than Latin. The collects were translated, but you have a situation, particularly in the big cities in northern Germany, where Latin is used in the liturgy quite extensively right up until the 1790s. And this is a fact that often gets kind of lost in the shuffle. However, the Formula Missae was not Luther's only word on liturgy. There is, of course, his Deutsche Mass, which is produced 3 years later. And this isn't intended to replace the Latin version, but rather it was provided for the sake of country parishes, places where there was no grammar school, where there was only a few people, hopefully including the pastor, who knew Latin. And so it was necessary to provide an entirely vernacular service. And the thing that Luther does in order to make this easier is to use the chorale as a vehicle for the liturgy. So instead of the old Latin chants, you get new chorales based on the old Latin chants, setting metrical versions of the ordinary of the Mass. So you get the Kyrie Gott Vater, which is a German translation of Kyrie Bonitatis, which was one of the most popular of the uncommonly used late medieval troped Kyries. And then there's All Glory Be to God on High, to give it its English first line, which was produced by Decius in 1531 to substitute for the Gloria in Excelsis. Then the Creed is turned into a metrical version, Wir glauben all, we all believe, again to a tune based on the common German plain song for the Nicene Creed. Then Isaiah, prophet, substitutes for the Sanctus, and then there's God's Lamb, which substitutes for the Agnus Dei. And Luther reorders the Mass somewhat for the Deutsches Mass. You still have a Kyrie, an introit, but now it's in the form of a vernacular chorale. This is followed by the Kyrie, the Collect of the Day, translated into German, the Epistle in German, another chorale to serve as the gradual, the Gospel in German, Wir glauben for the Creed. The sermon then follows, which is usually preceded by some sort of bidding prayer. This is where the prayer for the church comes into a lot of these early liturgies. It's part of the bidding prayer before the sermon. Then after that, there's an exhortation, a paraphrase of the Lord's Prayer, a sort of explanation of what is happening in the communion service, the words of institution, and then whilst the bread and the wine are elevated and distributed separately, they sing Jesaja dem Propheten as the Sanctus. The whole thing is rounded off with Gottes Lamb and a prayer of thanksgiving and the Aaronic blessing. And this preserved the bones of the old Eucharist in a new vernacular German dress. And in some respects, it was quite a conservative work, because Luther's tendency was to preserve the liturgical year as it stood. And to this day, there's very, very little difference between the liturgical year that is used in the 1928 Book of Common Prayer and the one-year sequence which is used, for instance, by the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. The Wisconsin Synod's sequence is a little bit different, because we've been borrowing back and forth off each other for basically 500 years, with the result that nobody at half the time quite knows who had which idea first. Luther didn't have a clear preference for German or Latin in the Mass. What he based it on was the presence of a grammar school or university. If it was a university town or there was extensive grammar school, by which I mean gymnasium or high school provision, he expected Latin to be used, and he left the German Mass for the country folks. And as a result of this, the two forms tended to merge with each other over the years. And you get a very prominent example of that in Leipzig. And Leipzig is one of the major North German centers of Lutheranism. Now, this always comes as a little bit of a shock when you remember that Duke George was one of Luther's main opponents for the first 20 years the Reformation is underway. But when Duke George kicks the bucket in 1539, Leipzig very rapidly goes over to the Lutheran cause, and it becomes one of the major centers in in Saxony and in southeastern Germany for the Reformation. And Leipzig developed a very elaborate liturgy, mainly because of the fusion of elements from the Formula Missae and the German Mass. And by the time you get to J.S. Bach, one of the greatest contributions of J.S. Bach to liturgiology is that it forces people to write about early 18th century Lutheran orthodoxy in a serious manner, rather than just dismissing it as a dead relic of the past. And what you find in Leipzig is the Formula Missae and the Deutsche Mass have kind of fused. And so you have in Bach's time a service order which runs like this on the major feast days. It starts with an opening chorale, then the introit, the Kyrie, then follows the Gloria, the Kyrie in Greek, the Gloria in Latin, the Collect and Epistle are in German. There is then a chanted gradual in Latin, followed by a German chorale. Then you have the Gospel in German. Wir Glauben is always used as the creed. Then the bidding prayer and sermon follow. And then you have, after that, the Gospel cantata. And a lot of the Gospel cantata is after the Gospel and before the creed. I have to get that right. After the Gospel, before the creed. Then after the creed, you have the sermon. And the cantatas have to be seen as being liturgical pieces. I know we're used to hearing them 2 or 3 in a concert, but they were liturgical pieces, an integral part of the main Mass, and Mass is what they would have called it, in early 18th century Leipzig. After the sermon came the Sursum Corda and the proper preface in Latin, followed by the Sanctus in Latin. Then the Lord's Prayer was sung in German, then the words of institution followed, complete with elevations and Sanctus bells. Communion then followed whilst the Agnus Dei and the Communion cantata were sung. Then to finish out the service, there's a post-communion thanksgiving and the Aramaic blessing and another chorale. And this whole thing took about 3 hours, because not only were you facing the usual 18th century 1-hour sermon, but also you're dealing with a church where communion was still the second highlight, the climax of the Sunday morning liturgy. So the liturgy of the word drew to a close with the sermon. And then there was an equally important climax with the general communion at the end of the liturgy of the Eucharist. And in Bach's time, the number of communions in Leipzig were significant. The population of Leipzig was about 23,000. And the surviving church records indicate there were well over 100,000 communions a year, most of them at the 2 main parish churches, St. Nicholas and St. Thomas. Now, the one thing you have to remember about late Orthodox Leipzig is that every communion was preceded by a confession. None of this general confession business in Leipzig. You trooped off to see the pastor and made your confession. He wrote your name in the book, and then you were expected to present yourself at the next communion service. And this made an awful lot of work for the pastors, which is why general confession and corporate absolution become more popular in Lutheranism towards the end of the 18th century. They're not really that well thought of in early Lutheran days. Now, I've got a long way ahead of myself by reflecting on how the 2 liturgies merged. But, you know, just as Leipzig was one center of Lutheran orthodoxy, another was Nuremberg. And Nuremberg is really where the story connects into England in quite a straightforward way. As you'll remember, in between his career as an academic and his career as Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer had a brief spell as one of Henry VIII's diplomats. And he gets sent on a wild goose chase over half of Germany looking for the Holy Roman Emperor and winds up in Nuremberg. And he replaces the existing British minister, English minister there, minister in the sense of diplomatic representative, not pastor, and prepares to settle down in Nuremberg. And it's his first hands-on experience of a fully reformed city. Nuremberg had gone over to the Reformation quite early. The city fathers had tried to avoid trouble with the emperor by banning the publication of Luther's books, but instead of them being printed and sent out the front door, they were printed and sent out the back door. Andreas Osiander was the senior pastor in the churches of Nuremberg, and he spearheaded the work of Reformation. He was helped on by the fact that the Reformation was very much a popular movement. The Nuremberg Nightingale, Hans Sachs, wrote a great deal of poetry and song in support of the Reformation. And so when Wagner wrote his opera Der Meistersinger de Nuremberg in 1867, he's kind of cocking a snook at the Bavarian Catholic establishment, playing the Volkisch card, and also honoring a period where Nuremberg had really flowered, not just as a center of printing, but as a center of theology and learning. And so he's harking back to what was a golden age for the second city of post-Congress Bavaria. Now, the reason Nuremberg became so influential is because of the 1533 Brandenburg-Nuremberg church order. Now, the Brandenburg we're talking about is Brandenburg-Anhalt, which was a small principality next door to the imperial free city of Nuremberg. And Brandenburg-Anhalt and Nuremberg agreed to have a common liturgical text and a common church order to go along with it, simply because they thought it would be too confusing, particularly in an area that was still leaning towards Catholicism, if the evangelical church spoke with a divided voice on the subject of liturgy. And quite naturally, Osiander was a major figure in putting together the Brandenburg-Nuremberg church order, but he was assisted by Johannes Brentz. And Brentz is one of those figures you keep tripping over. Just as you trip over Bugenhagen anytime you're in northern Germany or Scandinavia, you fall over Brentz in the southern Germany. He was originally from Württemberg and is honored to this day as the great reformer there. But at various other times he was to be found in Nuremberg, he was to be found in Bonn. He tended to get invited elsewhere to help organize the Reformation there. And the Brandenburg-Nuremberg church order sort of combines elements from both the Formula Missae and the German Mass, but it's the Formula Missae which is very much in control of the agenda. So the Mass begins with the priest going to the altar and saying the Confiteor. This is followed by a Latin introit, the Kyrie in Greek, the Gloria in Latin. The collect, it's not clear from the text whether it was in German or Latin at this stage. The epistle was read in German, the Alleluia followed in Latin, the Gospel in German. The Creed was to be sung where there were chanters in Latin, but in an ordinary congregation in German. The bidding prayer and the sermon then followed, and great emphasis is laid on the fact there should be a sermon every time communion is celebrated. And then this is followed by an exhortation which moves smoothly into a prayer which leads into the Verba, ending with the Sanctus. So the preface, the traditional preface, has been eliminated. This is followed by the Our Father in German, and the Agnus Dei is sung during communion, and this the service concludes with a post-communion thanksgiving and the blessing. And Brandenburg-Nuremberg is one of those church orders which becomes really rather dominant. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that the family that controlled Brandenburg-Anhalt also had a much larger principality, modern-day Brandenburg, which consisted of the area around Berlin. And as Brandenburg's political importance increased, it was already electoral, but as its importance increased, so its political sway amongst the churches of northern Germany increased. And Big Brandenburg basically inherited Little Brandenburg's church order in 1540. And it preserves the Brandenburg-Nuremberg order in all respects except one, and that is they replaced the Sanctus with a German hymn, but not the usual Jesaja dem Propheten. They use a different hymn. The other features of the Brandenburg-Nuremberg liturgy, which look very familiar, are things like the litany. And the litany there is made up of the familiar sequence of short petitions, but there's a greater variety of responses to the petitions. You can begin to see an echo of Cranmer's approach in 1544. Cranmer actually does a much better job in that he consolidates the many short petitions of the Brandenburg-Nuremberg litany into something a little bit more bite-sized, instead of them being crumbs. But the basic structure is the same as Brandenburg-Nuremberg. The office is another area where Brandenburg-Nuremberg anticipates the Book of Common Prayer. Now, if there's one thing that drives me mad about Anglo-Catholic liturgiologists, is they will ransack the libraries of Europe for some failed humanist attempt at church reform to prove that that is where something in the Book of Common Prayer comes from, whilst walking past half a dozen German church orders that do exactly the same thing, because they're absolutely determined to have nothing to do with the Lutheran liturgical tradition. But when you look at the Brandenburg office, it actually feels kind of familiar. The instructions given for it are very sketchy. This has a lot to do with the fact that most of the German church orders were written on the basis of, right, lads, you know what you do already, we're just telling you what's different. And with the Brandenburg-Nuremberg version of the daily office, the instructions are that you begin with the accustomed antiphon, you sing 2 psalms, you have a chapter from the Gospel, you sing the Te Deum, and then you have the Lord's Prayer, the Collect of the Day, and the Benedicamus to finish the service off for the morning. It's the evening one that's rather interesting, in that you have the antiphon, couple of psalms, then they've mentioned catechizing. And catechizing is an integral part of Vespers in the Nuremberg way of doing things. It's then followed, after you've catechized the juniors, the Magnificat is then sung. Following the Magnificat, the seniors are catechized, then the Nunc Dimittis is sung, and then you have the usual Lord's Prayer, Collect, Benedicamus ending that you find with most Lutheran attempts at reforming the office. And you can begin to see in this attachment of catechesis to the evening office something that becomes a very familiar feature of the Book of Common Prayer. The injunction that you get time and again in from the 1550s onwards, that after the second lesson at evening prayer, The curate shall catechize the young and apprentices and other servants according to the form given in this book. And it's very difficult not to think that this is just an idea that was lifted by the English reformers straight out of the Nuremberg-Brandenburg way of doing things. Now, given the direct contacts between Cranmer and Brandenburg, the Brandenburg-Nuremberg liturgy, and given the direct contacts between Cranmer and Bucer, or Butzer, it's no surprise to find that another version of the 1533 Brandenburg-Nuremberg liturgy has a big influence on the 1549 prayer book. And that is a work that is usually referred to in English as, and I hope I get the epithets the right way round, a simple and pious consultation, which is purportedly the work of Archbishop Herman von Wied, but actually is Butzer and Melanchthon. And it was drawn up in Bonn for a failed attempt at reforming the Archdiocese of Cologne. And a lot of the material that was used for the reform of the church in the Archdiocese of Cologne finds its way into the 1549 Book of Common Prayer. And a lot of the material that found its way into the pious consultation came from the Brandenburg-Nuremberg liturgy. So you have this direct link between the Brandenburg-Nuremberg church order, the pious consideration, and the 1549 prayer book. And you can bet your bottom dollar that when you do read Proctor and Frere on that, they will gloss over it fairly quickly. It just was not sexy to borrow that much material from the Lutherans. And it was compounded even worse when it was made even worse when it passed through an unimpeachably, unless you ask Bullinger, reform source like Butzer. What Butzer was trying to do in helping von Wied to help himself was to produce a church order that for Cologne that was traditional enough not to upset people unnecessarily, but nonetheless advance the cause of the Reformation in the electorate. Now, von Wied was very much of a victim of mid-16th century power politics. He was squeezed out of the Archbishopric of Cologne by the Emperor Charles V. Butzer found it very convenient to go back to Strasbourg. Melanchthon found it equally convenient to go back to Wittenberg. And the whole thing is one of the great might-have-beens of the second generation of the Reformation. However, the book that Butzer and Melanchthon wrote for the Archbishop received a fairly wide circulation, and although it was not used except in the relatively small city of Wesel in its original form, it nonetheless proved very influential in England, because really it was the last major church order that appeared before Henry VIII died, and Cranmer got the green light to create a vernacular English liturgy. Now, if we think about this for a bit, there has already been almost 25 years of experimentation, and a lot of it quite successful, before Cranmer has the opportunity to do something large-scale in England. Henry VIII was forever tinkering around the edges. He would allow Cranmer to reform some of the minor English Latin uses out of existence. He would allow Cranmer, for example, to publish the litany in English. He would allow certain ceremonies to be abolished. But the meat and potatoes of the Sarum Missal remained in force as long as Henry VIII breathed, and he had no intention in giving Cranmer carte blanche to replace them. So Cranmer did a certain amount of preparation on the QT before Henry's death. Things like the Litany of 1544, some of the orders of prayer that he wrote, are sort of examples of Cranmer trying his wings at writing liturgical English. At the same time, he was very alive to what was going on in continental Europe. Cranmer did not operate in a vacuum. And one of the things that can be very perplexing for historians with an axe to grind is that Cranmer doesn't neatly fit into anybody's categories. He was a correspondent of Melanchthon. His longest and probably most intense correspondence was with Butzer. He wrote to Calvin. He wrote to Bullinger. He wrote to Brentz. He wrote to Osiander. He was in constant contact with the major figures on the continent, but he never gave his heart and mind to any of them. When he identifies himself as being reformed, he does so to a certain extent on his own terms. His closest theological relative, I think, in many ways, is Butzer. But you can also detect the influence of Bullinger, particularly in Cranmer's writings on the Lord's Supper. And when Cranmer came to put together the first Book of Common Prayer, in one sense, he has an eye firmly on the Sarum liturgy, but he also has an eye on those liturgies from Germany with which he is familiar. So you've got the 1543 attempted reform in Cologne, you have the 1533 Brandenburg-Nuremberg liturgy, and doubtless others had come into his hands during the intervening period. And one of the things that you discover looking at both of the Edwardian prayer books is that, first of all, Cranmer isn't afraid to make difficult decisions when it comes to the liturgy. The most difficult decision of all, I think, was to go straight for an English language liturgy. There's none of this shilly-shallying back and forth between English and Latin once the decision had been made to publish a complete prayer book in 1549. Secondly, you can see a growing influence from Butzer between the first prayer book and the second. The first prayer book very much has Butzer's Cologne order in the background. The second one receives a lot more influence from the Strasbourg order. And it's those two issues that I really want to go into next week. So next week, what we have to look forward to are the first two prayer books and Cranmer implementing his program for reform. Other major German liturgies which are worth a look if you ever get the opportunity are Brunswick from 1528, which is Bugenhagen's great exemplar. That one is very influential in northern Germany. And one of the things we have to be very clear in our minds when it comes to northern Germany is that black gown and bands is not the Lutheran way of doing things. If you have a look on the internet for Nuremberg and chasubles, you will find that as late as the 1770s, new chasubles were being made for the Lutheran Rite in Germany. It's only with rationalism and the Prussian ascendancy that you get the black gown version of Lutheranism being imposed throughout Germany. And that in itself comes with that dreaded word unionism, which leads to one of the more interesting little sidelights on the history of the prayer book. In the 1730s, the soldier king, Friedrich Wilhelm I, proposed unifying the Lutheran and Reformed churches in Prussia on the basis of a German translation of the 1662 prayer book. And it's that sort of relationship to both the Reformed tradition and the Lutheran tradition which was to become very much the inheritance of the English Book of Common Prayer. And I've managed to run out of material with 2 minutes to spare. Okay, I think it's question time. And I know I scamped on the Reformed liturgy.
Yeah, would you like me to chime in?
On the Reformed, yes. It's
Okay.
not my favorite subject.
All right. What I will do is drop some tidbits, hopefully to entice people to invite other people to come and listen to what you're going to talk about next week. What I want to do is give just some brief background on Butzer, because his import in the Reformation cannot be underestimated. As a matter of fact, no less a luminary than McCullough, Continus Hopf, H-O-P-F, and E.R. Whitaker, three of the leading Reformation scholars of the day.
Yeah, I was reading all three of those today on Butzer, and I just haven't had time to assimilate it.
Yeah, they have indicated that Butzer should be considered one of the three, he should be considered within the group of the three most significant reformers in history, right next to Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin, because of his influence. Let me give you just a thumbnail, and this is just a thumbnail on Martin Butzer. As the Archbishop was talking about him, I was jotting down some things. I'm going to name some cities that you've all heard of from the Reformation: Heidelberg, Worms, Nuremberg, Wissenborg, Wittenberg, Zurich, Bern, the Diet of Augsburg, Leipzig, Hagenau, Worms, and Regensburg. Now, I've just covered from 1518 all the way up to approximately 1542.
The Martin Butzer World Tour.
Was there at every single one of those meetings. As a matter of fact, he met Luther at Heidelberg in 1518 during the first disputation, corresponded with Luther beginning in 1520, and for the rest of their lives, they were in dialogue. And at various points, if you know anything about Luther, he was all for Butzer, he was all against Butzer, he was all for Butzer, he was all against Butzer. This was Martin. And yet, Butzer was never out of the discussion of what was taking place during the Reformation. As the Archbishop pointed out, Archbishop Cranmer was a conciliator. He wanted to have an ecumenical dialogue with all of the branches of Protestantism going through the Reformation. Butzer was right there alongside of him. Butzer spent as much time dialoguing with Rome and trying to bring Rome into the Reformation as he did dialoguing with other reformers. The man is a profound influence. In 1531, he was introduced by Simon Grenaeus via correspondence to Archbishop Cranmer. And from 1531 until Cranmer's invitation to have Butzer come to England, they were in dialogue with one another. So this is just like a little whipped cream on top of the cake that you're going to get next week. And it's important to realize in his dialogue, in his relationship with Zwingli, with whom Butzer was very close, they became very close friends, because when Butzer was kicked out of Strasbourg, he begged Zwingli to give him refuge in Zurich, which Zwingli did, and they became friends from 1523 up until the Diet of Augsburg. When the Augsburg Confession was written, Butzer was on the side of the Lutherans. He made one correction, and I want you to listen to this because this ended the relationship between Zwingli forever. He wrote this, and Wolfgang Capito was also involved in creating this. He said, in this sacrament, his true body and true blood are truly given to eat and drink as food for their souls and to eternal life, that they may remain in him and he in them. Now that sounds fantastic to us. Luther went ballistic, because what does truly mean? Well, Capito turned around to Butzer and said, we need to strike this if we're going to remain unified. They did when they wrote the Tetrapolitan Confession, which they were writing side by side as Melanchthon was writing the Augsburg Confession. Zwingli turned around and he said, because you've removed that from the confession, we're done. Our relationship is over. And they never spoke again until Zwingli's death, and they never spoke again up until Zwingli's death in 1531. That was the last correspondence they had. Butzer even went so far as to say, if you cannot subscribe to the Tetrapolitan Confession, subscribe to the Augsburg Confession. Now, that's just the relationship that he had with the Lutheran side. We see the Archbishop mentioned von Wied. That's the relationship that he had with the Roman side. And what we don't hear all the time is that Melanchthon had only 15% of an influence in the consultation. Melanchthon was too busy with Luther.
Trying to keep Luther on the rails.
Exactly. Butzer wrote 85% of the consultation. And I'm not going to say anything more about that because I know the Archbishop will probably touch on that next week, so I'll leave that to him. But I want you to hear three things that come out of Butzer's quote-unquote censura, which is a terrible name for that. That's not what it was. When Goodrich asked, the Bishop of Ely asked Butzer to take a look and review the 1549. If you look at our prayer book, the one we use right now, I want you to listen to the rubric on page 82. It's always there. We hardly ever look at it, but I want you to listen to it because I'm going to read something out of Butzer in just a minute. In the rubric, during communion, this is what Cranmer writes. Then the priest shall receive the Holy Communion of both kinds, himself, and proceed to deliver to the same bishops, priests, and deacons in like manner, if any be present. And after that, to the people also in order, now here's the key, into their hands. Okay, mark that because I want you to listen to this. This is Butzer's censura. You can pick this up anywhere you want. Okay? Listen to what Butzer says. This was one of the suggestions that comes out of his writing. He says this. The paragraph requires that the bread of the Lord is to be put into the mouth and not into the hands of the individual. I do not understand how this is consistent with the reason which is adduced for it in the paragraph itself. That is, lest anyone might not eat it, but take it away secretly and abuse it to superstitious and appalling wickedness. The suggestion of putting the host into the mouth, now, we can argue whether Cranmer heard this and said, yes, I'm actually going to do that. It's in the rubric. It's there. Now, I want you to listen to another one. This one's awesome. I love this one. This comes from 1549. Okay? Listen to this. In the prayer for the state of the church, as the Archbishop talked about earlier, there was this horrendous battle on the Reformation side of making sure that the Eucharist wasn't considered a propitiatory sacrifice. This was what was written in the 1549. We commend unto thy mercy, O Lord, all other thy servants, which are departed hence from us, with the sign of faith, and now do rest in the sleep of peace. Grant unto them, we beseech thee, thy mercy and everlasting peace, and that at that day, the general resurrection, we and all they which be of the mystical body of the Son may altogether be set on his right hand and hear that his most joyful voice. Now that's the 1549. Bucer looked at that and said this. And when I read this, you're going to go, oh, yeah, I understand. I can listen to this. But when prayer is offered for the dead, that the Lord will grant them his mercy and everlasting peace, the common man supposes that this implies that the departed still feel the want of that peace and therefore of that full mercy of God by which he pardons their sins, and that the primary purpose of our prayers is to gain them things for them. No occasion must be given for this error, especially when we recognize how great a torrent of worse than heathen superstition, you got to love the flair, and how great a pestilence to true religion has been poured out and blown up upon the people who boast the name of Christ by Satan through his antichrists, etc. Listen, this is what he says. This is my suggestion, Bucer says. For these reasons, my own preference would be to omit the commendation of the dead and the prayer for their eternal peace. In place of this commendation and prayer, the following passage should be added to the preceding prayer, in which we may ask that we may follow the example of the saints and their steadfast faith and faithfulness and their keeping of the commandments. Does that sound moderately familiar?
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the invocation, where it says that we may follow their good example, that's where it comes from. One last thing I want you, and this is just an incidental thing, and I'm avoiding the major stuff because I want the Archbishop to hit the major stuff. This comes again from the book. This comes again from the 1549. And one of the things that Bucer really had an issue with was what he considered to be some unexplainable practices. In the 1549, which we no longer say, in the rubric, it states this for the baptism of children. Now listen carefully to what the rubric says. Then shall the priest demand of the child, which shall first be baptized, these questions following. Did you catch that?
Mm-hmm.
The priest is going to demand of the child, and then then there are a series of questions. Here's Bucer's comment. However, I can't approve of the words which the book provides to be said when this sign is made on the forehead and breast of infants. This is not because they do not express a holy aspiration. And this is one of the key things about Bucer. Bucer was never, ever opposed to the ancient traditions of the church, ever. Not because they don't express a holy aspiration, but because they're required to be said of an infant who doesn't understand them. And then if you go on and you read it, which I won't do, but if you go on and read it, what he does is he suggests that it's either the parents or the godparents that should make the proper response, which if we look now at the 1552, that's exactly what the rubrics state. So if you ever get any free time, I know we're all really busy, I certainly would commend you look at this man, because his influence is just astounding. He was influential in the Lutheran Church because of his relationship with Melanchthon after, well, and obviously Luther, but Melanchthon afterwards. He was influenced at the Scottish Church, with the Archbishop already said, because he was influential in Calvin's liturgy, Calvin's understanding of the Eucharist comes directly from Butzer.
Mm-hmm.
And Butzer's understanding of the Eucharist is an outworking of his relationship with Luther. So you've got the Reformed, you've got the Scottish, and now you've got the relationship that he had with Cranmer, which helped influence some of the changes that were made in the Book of Common Prayer. He suggested 52. Between 24 and 28 were actually incorporated. Now, whether or not they came directly from there or not, the fact of the matter is they're virtually identical to the changes that were made. You're looking at 50% of the recommendations that he made have become a part of the Book of Common Prayer.
And then you also get some Bucerisms like the incorporation of the Ten Commandments.
And commandments at
the communion liturgy, which is something that he was doing in Strasbourg in the late 1530s.
Yep.
If the Reformation is a cocktail party, Bucer is the guy in the room who everybody knows.
Yep.
And at times, he's the guy in the room that nobody likes.
Exactly.
Bucer fascinates me, but he's very hard to chase up in English because he's only really been recognized the last, I think the first full-length study in over half a century was in 2003 or thereabouts. He's grossly neglected.
Yeah.
Just simply because I think his influence is so diffuse.
To dovetail on that, Your Grace, McCullough is generally, and you can speak to this better than I because you're the Reformation historian per se. McCullough is considered probably what? The leading Reformation scholar today? Okay. McCullough's biography of Cranmer is approximately 600 pages. Of that 600 pages, Butzer is mentioned 100 times. He's mentioned on 100 pages. That's an incredible amount of time for one man to be mentioned in another man's biography, and that individual not an important part of what is taking place in that biography.
What is becoming increasingly apparent to me is that there's a kind of middle group in the Reformers. The names vary a little bit, but certainly you've got Butzer, you've got Thomas Cranmer, you have Melanchthon, at times you have Brentz, at times you have Osiander, at times you have Calvin, depends which way he's facing that week, i.e. whether he's dealing with Zurich or with
Luther,
who are trying to pull the thing together and either produce a unified Protestant Reformation or at least keep everybody talking to each other long enough for the situation to stabilize. And Cranmer, Calvin, Butzer, Melanchthon never gave up on the dream of producing a unified reforming church. However, circumstances worked against them. Melanchthon's biggest problem in a roundabout way was Flacius, who was absolutely determined that he was going to take a conservative interpretation of Luther on things like the real presence in the Eucharist. I think Calvin's biggest problem was that he had to appease Bullinger to a certain degree to maintain Swiss unity. So there's a triumph to a certain degree of local interests over this broader reforming movement, which centers, for the sake of argument, on Strasbourg.
When Calvin, it's interesting that you bring that up, because Calvin's connection to Butzer is so integral to the development of Calvin that Calvin's concept of church and state comes from Butzer and Strasbourg. He didn't develop that on his own. And if we have time some other time later on, we can talk about that. But when Calvin appeared in 1540, I believe, at the Second Wittenberg Concord, because of his connection to Butzer, Calvin was immediately sent over to the Lutheran delegation. Even though they knew that he had taken some issue with Luther's view on the sacrament, at least as it was presented to him. I will put it that way. And the Lutherans accepted him. They didn't have any problem with it. And Calvin had seen what happened to Butzer in his relationship with Zwingli. Anytime Butzer attempted any sort of rapprochement to any other group. So on the one hand, you've got Butzer, who has this mind of Cranmer in ecumenical unity of the Reformation churches, trying to create that. And then on the other hand, you've got Calvin looking at the abuse that Butzer, because he was kicked out of everywhere. He was kicked out. He was kicked out of Strasbourg. He was kicked out of Zurich. I mean, he was just persona non grata for everybody. That's why he wound up in England. He had no place else to go. I mean, Cranmer was being gracious, but Butzer was screwed. I mean, he had no place to go. So Calvin, now being the type of person that he was anyway, who couldn't stand direct personal confrontation, couldn't stand it. In writing, he'd rip you apart, but personally, he just hated that. He winds up doing what the Archbishop says. He winds up placating people when he really shouldn't have placated. The Consensus Tigurinus and the fact that he signed that, for me, the single greatest mark against Calvin. He should never have conceded in signing that, because that just turned the Eucharist into a Zwingli and nothing. And he didn't believe that. Calvin didn't believe that.
The unfortunate thing about the Reformed tradition is the tendency has always been with the Reformed to veer towards Zwingli on the Eucharist.
Unfortunately.
And unfortunately, the two most creative Reformed thinkers, who were Butzer and Calvin, neither of them believed that.
Yeah.
That their understanding was far more dynamic. And you can talk with both Calvin and Butzer in terms of a real presence. But the real presence is not in the elements, it is in the celebration.
Exactly.
And you get a reflection of the sort of language that Butzer and Calvin would have used about the Eucharist in the prayer of consecration of the 1928 prayer book. You don't get it in the English prayer book. The English prayer book's much more Lutheran in that regard. But there is a definite parallelism between what you get in the Scottish non-juror rite, which is the granddaddy of our 1928, and the sort of Eucharistic prayers that were offered up as a model in the Strasbourg liturgy, in Calvin's Geneva liturgy. The thought forms are there. You get things like an invocation of the Word and Holy Spirit. You get the words of institution placed in the context of the saving work of Christ. And although this is very formalized in the Scottish liturgy of 1737, it is something that has been, it actually is not one of the things that distances the Scottish Episcopal tradition from Calvinism. What distances the Scots Episcopalians from Calvinism is their attitude to do double predestination, which Scots Presbyterians would fight over like Kilkenny cats back in the late 17th, early 18th century. And the other thing was their method of church government. Away went the presbytery and in came the bishop. So there's still a considerable reformed outlook to the Scottish liturgy, but it's a reformed outlook which has one eye on the Greek fathers and one eye on Butzer and Calvin at their most positive. And this is one of the things that we have to realize, that you don't have a, Reformed is not the polar opposite of primitive. The Reformed tradition theologically is extremely creative. and often find solutions to problems where the two extremes, who I usually represent by saying the Pope and Zwingli, whereas the two extremes tend to hunker down into their own particular forms of rationalism. Because transubstantiation is as rationalistic in its way as the outright denial of any sort of presence in the Eucharist on the other.
And when Calvin was writing, this was the key to the confusion with Calvin. When Calvin was writing to the Zwinglians, he was writing criticizing the concept of an ordinance, and he would hammer on the concept of a real presence, on a real presence. But when he was writing to the Lutherans, he would use, well, it's a sign, because he didn't define real presence in the manner that they defined it. So with Calvin, you've got to figure out with whom he's speaking to get some sense as to what he means by the language that he uses. I got one quote, and then I'll stop, because I can see Father Patrick is ready to jump in here.
I just got something I want to. Yeah.
This comes from Brian Garish, who was the dean of historical theologians in the United States for many years. Steinmetz and Muller and all these guys studied under Garish. He quotes this, and you can reference this. The most interesting testimony to Luther's goodwill is an anecdote related by both Christoph Pezel and Rudolf Hospinian. All right, Morris Gulch was a Wittenberg bookseller, and he brought back the Latin translations of Calvin's short treatise on the Lord's Supper from a Frankfurt book fair in 1549. He presented it to Luther as a gift, who, after reading the treatise closely, said with particular care that had Zwingli and Ecclesiastes spoken like Calvin, there would have been no need for a long dispute.
I just wanted to jump in just to make sure, because, you got a lot of people on here. I know Steve and Terry are on here, Julie are on here. Some of them are, I'm junior liturgics guy compared to you guys. I feel like after listening to Father Paul, I was like, yeah, all right, I still got a lot more reading to go. And I thought I was doing pretty good on my reading. But, maybe you guys might want to clarify a little bit more. I completely understand that you take all these guys, and they were the super smart guys of their time, very religious guys. They were all writing back and forth, sharing back and forth, the Reformation. You had a lot of people that even were under these guys writing back and forth, England, all over. I mean, there was conferences going on all the time. There was, this was just not, these guys were the leaders, but there was a lot of undercurrent going on that were driving these movement that, these folks had contributions to. And I think you guys a little bit maybe want to clarify a little bit, but, our prayer book is an English prayer book, has great influence from a lot of, they took a soup with a lot of vegetables and a lot of meat and a lot of stuff from a lot of different places, but it's still our soup. And I think Cranmer, one of the things that we get lost in the conversations when we talk about these folks is that there are other players, even on the English side, that was really in kind of somewhat between you and the bishop's conversation. Really tonight makes it sound like it's swinged over to the German side, which we know it has a great influence.
The thing was, everybody wrote in Latin. And so you have figures in England like Coverdale, Goodrich, Cranmer, Holbeach,
Parker,
Barnes. They're all writing to the continent on their own behalf. And they are writing to each other. What you're looking at is a late flowering of the medieval concept of the community of letters. So you're not looking at the local expression of the Reformation might be Saxon or Prussian or Hanoverian or Nurembergish or English. but they're part of a much wider community. They're sharing ideas. And although you get a particular English prayer book, a particular English set of articles, it's forged in the common furnace of the ideas that are being exchanged between Swiss, French, German, Dutch, at times Danish, Swedish, and English and Scots theologians, even a few Italians like Peter Martyr. They're all exchanging letters. It's part of an international movement. The particular expressions are local, and it's extremely local in Germany. You go 30 miles up the road and they've got a different church order. England, by comparison to that, is the macro picture. I mean, you have got one use for the whole realm of England, which is about the size of half of the German possessions of the Holy Roman Emperor. So, you know, it's a relatively large-scale thing. And England was terribly influential in the later 17th century in Protestantism. 16th century in Protestantism because, one, it was a major Protestant power. Two, it was not involved in the cockpit of European politics. And so Queen Elizabeth could be relied upon to offer moral support, and usually not much more than that because she didn't like putting her hand in her pocket, to the Protestant cause in Northern Europe. The trouble we have with historians, and I'm talking about this as poacher turned gamekeeper, as it were, is that historians tend to be very parochial. Modern history as a discipline is a product of the late 18th, early 19th century flowering of national consciousness, which is a product of the Romantic movement. So you get the start of, German historical studies start in the 1780s. Modern history becomes a discipline at Oxford in the 1860s. So, historians tend to be very parochial, whereas theologians have always been a much more international set of beings. With the result that when the two meet, it sounds like, oh, what's going on, pal? But yeah, I mean, England had its own unique set of challenges.
And one of the things that we, to address your question, Father Patrick, is that one of the things that we can't go into by virtue of the nature of the course that the Archbishop is presenting is the fact that at this particular time, within the late 1400s and the early 1500s, the concept of nationalism starts to rise to the fore, and you wind up with these, for lack of a better phrase, it's not an accurate way to describe it, but you wind up with these city-states, as the Archbishop was saying. So you've got this, you get on a horse, the horse goes one way, and you're going to find this protector or this lord who has his own fiefdom that he's trying to create, and he's got a reformer, and he's going to support that reformer. Well, if you go 40 miles in the other direction, you've got another duke who's got the same situation in his little area, and he's got a reformer, and he's going to support him. So this is what's leading away. This is what is the backdrop, if you will, to why all of these reformers are now rising to the surface and chipping away slowly at the hegemony of the quote-unquote Holy Roman Empire. And it does provide an important element to what we're taught, what the Archbishop is lecturing on and will be lecturing. We just don't have the time to go into all of it. It's
no. And you really look at the beginning of the printing press, and then you look at the beginning of the Reformation, and now we're seeing the first time in history where we really have this great, I don't want to say international, but within the Europe communities, these great conversations and great people sharing ideas, and kind of opening up all these levels of communication. And we can see the beginning of the change of of just the whole society and the way that we interact, almost international.
Just to throw one weird idea out at you. If you were a printer in Germany and your local duke was sympathetic, you could publish anything. So in Wittenberg, you published Luther. Leipzig lost its printing industry because Duke George would not let them print Luther's works. There were relatively large numbers of printing presses in Germany, and not all of them were terribly tightly controlled. And as a result, the reformers got their opportunity to spread information through the well-developed German printing industry. Now, if somebody tried to do that in England, where all the printing presses were within a mile of St. Paul's Cathedral, the Bishop of London could come down on them like a ton of bricks and prevent them printing what would have been perceived as heretical literature, which is why most of the early Protestant works that came into England were printed by underground presses run by Antwerp printers somewhere out in the polder where the bishop couldn't find them. And you've got this tremendous, almost a black market of ideas, where you have underground printing presses, decoy operations. You know, there's some real cloak and dagger stuff going on because the printers are chasing the profit. You know, that's profit with an F. Because they are wanting to print what sells, and what sells is Martin Luther. Erasmus at times could get himself banned. They want to sell Melanchthon. They want to sell Bugenhagen, because Bugenhagen's turning stuff out in Low German. They want to print Tyndale because he's turning stuff out that they can use. They want to print Barnes if Barnes produces anything, because these guys are having new ideas, and this is what sells in the printing industry.
If you want a thread on which you can grab that'll give you an idea as to what the Archbishop is talking about, the simplest and the quickest way to get into this is do some research, and you can do it online. It's very quick, and the information is fairly decent. Look up Frederick of the Elector of Saxony at this time period, and what you will see is what the Archbishop is talking about, how the power of that one man protected so many different reformers at that time. And it'll give just go ahead, I'm sorry.
And the real laugh is Frederick was a diehard Catholic.
He was. That's exactly right. And yet he protected these men.
Mm-hmm.
So that'll give you kind of your in, if you will, as to what the Archbishop is talking about.
All right. Does anybody have any more questions for these two fine men? We're already almost 8 o'clock. And some of us got to go back to work.
Yeah. Well, I had a long day at work today. I just wanted to make one comment to the esteemed brethren here. Is that having grown up in the Eastern Rite, liturgy of John Chrysostom and St. Basil, I just find all this discussion very, very interesting, and it's very enlightening, so I'm enjoying it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, you're very lucky. I mean, we're all very lucky to have Father Paul and the bishop here. I mean, these guys are, I mean, they're up there on all this stuff, as you can see. And it's great just to hear them. You know, it'd be great if every week we could have them just ramble on. You'd be surprised what you'd learn in a year. Because they pull out some little facts. It's amazing.
Well, of all the conversations I've ever had, I guess rambling would be one of the best descriptions.
Well, we get raiding the compost heap at the back of the brain, the stuff we half remember.
All right. All right. God bless you guys. Y'all have a good week.
Right. Bye for now.